listening to In-Fisherman Storyline, North America's top voice in multi-species freshwater angling. Here is your host, Thomas Allen.
Yes, you are. Iowa. You were born in Iowa. I was not born in Iowa, but I consider Iowa my home.
Yeah, where were you born?
Wisconsin, Madison.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, I'm a Packers fan by default, but I consider Iowa my motherland, if you will.
And I've always appreciated the Packers, too, for that matter.
We have that in common. How about that? Hey, if you recognize that voice, that's Mr. Doug Stange. You're tuning into another special edition of Inside... Boy, I got that all wrong. I guess I need some more coffee. Let's try that one more time.
Okay.
And we're not going to edit that out because we like real life. Now this is In-Fisherman Storyline, and we're going to be digging into Doug's past. He's already kind of told me that he can't remember much, but I'll bet he's going to remember a lot of it. And I know that started in Iowa. So let's hear a little bit about your early Iowa fishing days, and was it catfish that captured you early on, or was it the Iowa Great Lakes?
Yeah, well, it's such a long story, and it was a long time ago. I'm 75 years old, so I've been at this a long time, and the timeline in my mind, looking back to those early days, doesn't fit. It doesn't go perfectly in line. There's these memories and so on, so that kind of thing. Catfish was always there for us. So the little town that I grew up in is Hull, Iowa, which is not far from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, about 60 miles to Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
Farm country.
Farm country for sure. To the north, Worthington, Minnesota, and to the east, the Iowa Great Lakes, 60 miles away. So in my immediate area, really no fishing except some of the smaller creeks had chubs, creek chubs. So a piece of liver, you're 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old in there. We would go to take a Sunday morning and go down to the creek and catch chubs. So there was that.
Mm-hmm. Well, hold on. You said something. This is important. We got to point this out. You said creek. And if you go anywhere outside of the Midwest, that is not acceptable.
I gotcha.
It's got to be creek. If you go into the South, all the big reservoirs have creeks coming in, and if you've got something running through your backyard in Minnesota, it's probably a creek. But I grew up saying crick.
Well, I never knew creek until later.
Yeah, and you can't even look up crick on the internet. I don't even think it's a legal word.
Well, I never thought of it, but you're right.
Yeah. Anyways,
so that kind of fishing early on. To the north, there's a river, classic catfish rivers, Little Rock River, flows into, even before that, there's an Otter Creek that flows into the Little Rock River, which flows into the Big Rock River, which flows into the Big Sioux River. So the Big Sioux River runs north and south from Sioux Falls, South Dakota to Sioux City. So that's on in the scape of things, but not early on. So early on, it was the creek fishing for the chubs. Sometimes we would head north, and my parents or grandparents would take us to the Little Rock River, and we would fish for catfish. Mm-hmm. Simple rigging. Then the other thing that was in play, of course, was an occasional trip to the Iowa Great Lakes. Mm-hmm. Now, going from Hull, Iowa, to the Iowa Great Lakes back in the day with a 54 Chevy, okay, you could drive those 70 miles an hour, and we did. And there's, big time speed limits back then even. But, that's still a trip.
Yeah.
Go to Sioux Falls where just to go out. That's a big trip.
Did you have a boat that went with you, or were you?
No, there was no thought of boats. All my fishing was from shore. Yep. If we had the occasional vacation that we took at the Iowa Great Lakes, we probably would rent a boat. But other than that, boats were out of the question. When we went to the Iowa Great Lakes, it was fishing from shore. Mm-hmm. There were these known spots, and it was a very different time.
I was going to ask. Because...
Yeah, because like on fishing the rivers, too, you could be dropped off in the river, walk 5 miles and be picked up in 5 hours, a little bit later on when you're 12 years old, and farmers wave at you as you go down the river. You could, the same thing. Even later than that, when I'm early days of In-Fisherman in the 1980s, there was still never a question of being on the river and parking a boat and getting out and fishing anywhere. And now you have those kinds of problems.
You do.
We don't. We didn't face those.
That's interesting to me because I had when we moved from Mount Horeb, Wisconsin, so from Wisconsin to Muscatine, Iowa, and I started fishing the Mississippi River in Muscatine. And then we moved north to a small town called Wilton, and we had this little creek down the road. I never asked permission. I never ran into a landowner, and I would fish that creek every single day the entire summer.
Right.
And it was the same thing as you'd said also. My mom would take me upstream. I mean, it was 5 miles to Kaufman's Bridge, we called it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had the day to get back to our house walking. And I think as the crow flies, it was 5 miles. So you can imagine probably twice that. And I would fish a hole for 5 minutes and move on. And I did see farmers, but no one ever said anything about it.
No.
But you get in trouble nowadays doing that.
Well, it's much different, yes. So, so that was, but even, going back to those days then, we also, bass weren't part of the question. And far as people who influenced me, I read all the big three magazines. I was a reader, that kind of thing. So Jason Lucas on bass, Joe Brooks was a mentor of sorts. Even we had no trout, but I read the trout stuff. And, that kind of thing. Ted Trueblood was a hero, of mine. I dreamed for years because of reading him talk about shooting elk and basting the elk ribs on an open fire, about doing that, and then finally did it some 30 years later.
That sounds fantastic right now.
And it can be good, yeah.
Let me ask you about the Iowa Great Lakes, and this is of personal interest because I pretty much, in my early adult years, started fishing there. And of course, that's some of the most expensive property in the state of Iowa. And about every square inch of shorefront on those lakes is pretty well developed.
Yes.
What was it like in your first time there that you can remember early days? Was there far fewer houses? What's the right thing to say?
West Okoboji was totally developed. Mm-hmm. And as I remember it, even back in the day, so say 60s, it was like $4,000 a square foot, which doesn't sound like much today, but it's probably $400,000. I don't know what it is.
That's probably a lot.
So West Okoboji was totally developed. East Okoboji, not so much so. Then when you went on to like Lower Gar and Upper Gar and Minnewaska was a little bit developed. The Gar Lakes, almost nothing.
Pretty much sloughs in those days.
Well, and this was before the Clean Water Act, dirtier water and that kind of thing. Much darker water than is there today. Mm-hmm. So East Okoboji, the east shore was not developed at all, for the most, as far as I can remember. And then Spirit Lake was pretty much, totally developed. So it hasn't, and then homes have come and gone. The old homes that were there, the old cabins that were, there for the summer are mostly long gone in favor of, permanent homes, or at least really nice homes that may only be summer homes for most of the people, but you could easily live there all year long. Yep. So, a lot different for sure, but still, bigly developed, but not like today.
Were there muskies in there back then?
The muskies were a product of the 60s.
Okay.
Jim McDonald was a great proponent. He started the Iowa Great Lakes Fishing Club, a very influential fella in the area in those times, and he was one of the early muskie guys in the area, and I'm sure he probably had some bearing on the stocking in the Okobojis, mm-hmm. mainly West Okoboji. I think Spirit came later, but so that would have been a product of the 60s, and I don't remember exactly for sure. I remember that I started fishing for muskies in the 70s, and so probably caught my first muskie, I don't remember, but it was probably 73, 45, right in there.
Right in the Great Lakes there, the Iowa Great Lakes?
Yeah. Okay. So where most of that muskie fishing was Emerson Bay, mm-hmm. Miller's Bay, Of course, Smith's Bay had some fish. The whole lake had fish, but, there were the classic spots that we fished. And the most memorable thing about muskies for me, probably the early days, was simply that I was a longtime hunter, pretty much fearless about everything, and this kind of thing. Never got nervous about deer hunting, bear hunting, or, I wasn't hunting bear at that time yet. But so the first musky follow that I ever had, so after reading about this, so casting a bucktail, the first musky follow that I had, of course, the fish didn't bite, and I stood there, and my knees were shaking. It was unbelievable. I couldn't stop my knees from shaking. And so it's the same thing that you get, when you're, and I never did get it with elk or bears or anything like that, but it was that thing. So quite remarkable, actually.
That's I can think of one fish in particular in Minnesota that did that for me, and it was on West Battle Lake. I don't know how many enormous fish I've encountered. Not many, we'll put it that way, like the ones that just make your knees knock. But I was literally casting towards the road that goes through Battle Lake, and I don't know what this fish measured, Doug. I have no idea, but a buddy that was with me said that was 55. I'm like, it could have been. I don't know, but when it turned sideways at the boat, it was a mile long, and I had to sit down. Of course, it didn't even swing at the bait. It just turned sideways just enough to look up at us and wave his little fin and take off.
Mm-hmm.
They do have a way to just put you on your knees or something.
Well, the whole muskie story for me would be a long one and a very, I was deeply involved in that from the very beginning with some of the better anglers. And so it's a long story. That's a story for another day.
Okay, well, we'll get into that. We got time. Beautiful thing about a podcast and an SD card is, just stop it and start again. So go back to the crick days. Was there a point where you were out on your own and you kind of had this discovery of, I really like this process of evaluating a river and finding the right spots and catching fish, specifically catfish, out of those rivers?
Well, certainly early on, it was a simple presentation most of the time, a hook. I think it was an Eagle Claw 84, but I don't remember for sure anymore. And then just a split shot, 6 inches above, and a piece of cut bait. Or we certainly tried, the early day stink baits at the time. I still have at home a jar of Bowkers that has to be more than 40 or 50 years old.
Have you opened it lately?
Yeah, it doesn't open anymore.
You probably don't want
It'll
to.
be, if you open it now, it'll be the last time.
Yeah.
But that's still there. And so the process for me of evaluation didn't really start until, certainly not when I was 12, 13, 14, 15. It was more like when I first, got out of college and started to go back to these rivers then, because when I got out of college, which was close by Westmar and Lamar's, Iowa, which isn't far from where I grew up in Hull. So you graduate from school, you get a job in Sibley, Iowa, which isn't far from the Iowa Great Lakes. So I'm coaching and teaching science, middle school science. And so now we start to fish these waters again. And it starts to dawn on me, how these things are running. It's really pretty obvious. So the whole riffle, pool, run idea, which isn't a fathomless idea for sure, but it was quite remarkable for the time. Nobody had ever done that before or stated it in that way, that rivers run in a continuous series of riffles, hole, riffle followed by a hole, and then a flattening out run, which then eventually becomes another riffle, hole, run. Mm-hmm. So once you start to think like that, then you begin to go up and down the river and you see that, okay, every riffle, hole, run isn't the same. So some are deeper, some are running faster, some have cover in them. The best ones typically had a really shallow riffle that ran quite quickly into a deeper hole with cover, with a really good cover. So it was that whole process, and that really took place probably when I was in my early 20s, because I was teaching school when I was 22 to begin with. And then it was at that time, too, that I eventually met Toad Smith, and we became friends. Mm-hmm. And he didn't think of the process that way, but he had a lot of observations and fishing. He had one fishing technique in particular that I had not applied, and that was to use simply a float. So instead of ticking along the bottom with the split shot and the rig, floating around, and then when it got to a sweet spot or a dead spot, you just let it sit there. Well, he would go one step farther, and a simple bobber, red, white bobber above the whatever it was, and sometimes no weight at all, and he'd drift that through the riffle and into the hole, and catfish love it. So, and I hadn't thought of that. So that was simple improvisation, and yet something that simple but quite remarkable for its time.
I got to tell you, the catfish fever video that you guys put out back in the day was my roadmap to understanding that process. And I don't know that I had a different. I may have had other opportunities, other fisheries to learn when it came to bass or other species I like to catch, but that creek being so accessible was right. I could ride my 10-speed down there, and I've told this story. I had the handlebars turned backwards, like a cool kid, but I had them turned backwards so I could put a fishing rod in there.
Oh yeah.
It was kind of like a little rod holder, anyways. So I rode that down, and I started recognizing what you had talked about with the riffles, holes, and runs, and it really. When I made that walk from, like I said a little bit ago, Kaufman's Bridge back to my house, you could eliminate all kinds of water and just walk those stretches. And, sometimes the outside turns, we're slowing down and fishing. But when I recognized what you were talking about, it was like I was just making a cast to catch a fish, catch two, go on to the next one. It was enlightening for me to look at it that way. And you're right. It took me going by myself, wanting to catch more fish and thinking, I remember Doug said, riffles, holes, and runs.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
The only other thing about those rivers in those days was the realization finally of how the connections between the little river or the creek to the little bit bigger river to the bigger river to the big river, how important that was. Because eventually one of the spots that I fished was Otter Creek, which was, I finally figured out, and now I don't remember the exact figure. A lot of times this is what I got to go out and, if you really want to get specific, but it's like 150 miles, I think, removed from the big river, which is the Big Sioux River. So again, it was Otter Creek, Little Rock River, which is a tiny river itself, into the Big Rock, which is no monster river, which went into the Big Sioux, which is a bigger river, but for much of the year it's very very low most of the time. Mm-hmm. So the realization then about how high water in the spring, catfish moved all the way up into Otter Creek, and they would be there as long as the water didn't. There was you had to have some water, but a lot of the Otter Creek was no more than a hole, and that was the other thing. A hole in a bigger river can be 8 feet deep, but in Otter Creek, a deep hole is like 3 feet.
Yeah.
If you're lucky to find 3 feet. And a big fish typically it would be a pound and a half would be a big fish. Mm-hmm. And so is that whole thing too. So a lot of discovery for sure.
Go back to your high school days. Did you play sports?
Yeah, I was a pretty good athlete. I lettered in 5 sports.
Mm-hmm. Back in the day when you could do that.
Yeah, so my best sport was certainly baseball, but in the springtime, then we golfed in the morning, and we ran track in the afternoon. And during the summertime, we played baseball, and in the fall, we played football, and in the winter, we played basketball.
Is that legal in Iowa to play basketball in the fall? Like, it's a wrestling state. You can't play basketball.
And where I grew up, there was no wrestling.
Wasn't there?
No, that came later. So
there were some teams up that way. I'm trying to think of the towns that still dominate today. LaSalle, I think, is.
Yeah, no, it doesn't ring a bell.
I don't know. I'd have to look at the map.
Yeah.
It's been a while, but anyway. So that led you to you eventually decided to teach and to coach. But where did you go to college at?
Well, there was a small school, Methodist school called Westmar College in Lamars, Iowa. So smaller town, smaller college. I think the maximum enrollment was probably 2,000 back in that era.
And teaching was the goal.
Oh yeah, my mother was a teacher, a great teacher. Father ran a car business, sort of, and so that was my background, and that's what I knew. So that's what I determined to do, and so went to school. Tried to play. I was a good basketball player, but too small. Good football player, but a little bit small. I'm talking about making the transition from high school to college.
Sure.
So I was a great defensive back. I played quarterback for 3 years in high school, but I was a better defensive back. And to make the choice, I should have probably been a defensive back and played football in college instead of trying to be a 5'10" point guard, which worked for not long.
Well, yeah. I
So,
mean,
anyway.
in Iowa, high school sports for sure, but
Right.
So if we were to go back to your high school, you suppose we could find some pictures of you and your sports gear back in the day?
Well, I think all there would be
Maybe a yearbook.
the yearbook. Yeah.
Oh. So you get into teaching, and I know that fishing's probably still in the forefront of your mind. Are you teaching to pay the bills and spending every waking minute you have on the water? How did your transition from that?
Well, when I first graduated, I fished. We were always fishing. There was never a time that I can remember that I didn't fish, but it was not the serious kind of mentality that eventually then developed shortly after I moved to Sibley, Iowa. So at that point, I played 4 years of college baseball, so that was actually my best sport. So I was hired basically to come and coach baseball in Sibley, and in the old days, if you could also teach, fine. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, but so I was teaching math, and I didn't have a big math background, but I had a good background in the sciences and that kind of thing. So that's how that kind of developed. But I remember that my first teaching contract was $6,200. So that didn't go very far.
Yeah.
And they paid me $500 to do the summer baseball coaching. And shortly after getting there, and then being quite close to the Iowa Great Lakes, that's when I started to get deeply involved in the fishing of the day. So Fishing Facts magazine was a factor in my development, as was being a member of the Iowa Great Lakes Fishing Club, as was some of the other stuff that I was doing on my own, because the biggest factor for me for finally ever getting into writing about fishing was the fact that my science background led me to a deep curiosity about the science involved in fishing and why there was no real connection between a lot of the questions that I knew science could answer that were never asked in fishing. So what colors could fish see? What could they hear? How deep could they go? All kinds of things about limnology. So shortly after getting to Sibley, I started to look at some of the fisheries stuff that was being done at Iowa State, a great fishery school, and I started ordering the fundamental books to do to be in the fishing classes. So fundamentals of limnology, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of famous texts that a lot of famous fisheries people started with. So I read them all. And some of it I couldn't understand, but there was all kinds of stuff in there that was of curiosity to me that I knew that fishermen, so that was the connection for me. It was this connection to the science and the questions that it would answer, and this led me to finally, and Al Linder, of course, has always been a real phenomenon on the freshwater scene, and he was already at that time, in the late 60s, early 70s. So by this time, I'm looking at Fishing Facts. They write some stuff for Fishing Facts. Eventually, they start In-Fisherman magazine, which is in 1975. Well, that's right in the middle of where I spent 10 years teaching and coaching. So in about the middle of that, by that time, I had ordered a dozen texts. Back in the day, there was a interlibrary loan system where you could get fishing papers that you wanted. They would send those to you for a small fee. And that was what led me to write a letter to Al at the time, probably about 1975, telling him in no short that I was the right thing for for a new time for In-Fisherman. And they had all, they weren't Al and Ron weren't great science people necessarily, but it was part of the beginning of the magazine, so it was an important part. They realized that this was an important part of the thing. So in 1977, I think it was, Al and Ron finally agreed to let me write a column called Bits and Pieces, which was all about the science of tying fisheries research tidbits to common stuff that fishermen wanted to know about that could impact their fishing.
It's still in our magazine today.
40-some years, and away you go. Yeah. 46 or 7, yeah.
So you talked them into letting you write an article. Was writing a thing that you had done before that you enjoyed, or you knew that you were capable of, or did that kind of develop through those years?
Well, I certainly wasn't a polished writer. I was always quite good at the logistics and logic of doing one thing after another. But the writing was self-taught, and as is the case with self-taught writers, usually comes about quite slowly.
Can confirm.
Okay.
Same way.
But it was a column, so it was short bits, 4 or 5 paragraphs about how deep do walleyes go. I remember one of the first ones, and it was quite remarkable because a guy a researcher, I think his name was Warnick, but I'd have to look, was fishing Oahe with gill nets for trying to do samples or sample the lake trout population that they had stocked, and with catching walleyes quite consistently 125 feet of water. Okay, well, I'd never been heard of before, so all of those kinds of things. What fish actually fed on in many instances.
Were you having to cite sources for this as you would probably a college paper, or were you kind of editorializing what you were finding?
Both. And a lot of the more technical stuff would almost always follow with the technical paper coverage. But sometimes it was, and what the fishermen actually more or less liked was for you to cut through a more difficult topic that the scientists, this was the other thing. The scientists of the time, the fisheries people of that time in the 70s, there was not a dominant connection of them trying to feed this information to fishermen and to make the connection between their constituency, which was these fishermen, and so there wasn't this back and forth. And that was also one of the things that started to happen in the 1970s. There was a lot of great fishery scientists who began to think about the quality of fishing. Before that, it was all about maximum sustainable yield. How much could this water produce? But some of the great fisheries people of the time began to see that the quality angling, as they called it at the time, quality fishing, was something that a lot of anglers were beginning to want. It wasn't just quantity, as they wanted quality. And one of the great guys of the time was Richard Anderson, and I got to know him, and so this is a long story too, and on a different technical side of things. But so this, what we started to do started to influence what fisheries guys were thinking, and back and forth. So all part of the process.
Well, unpack that a little bit. See, that's what fascinates me. Were you working with Iowa fisheries? Was it the Dakota fisheries? Where did you try to have influence? And were you a part of a group that were doing that?
Well, it wasn't that I was trying to have influence, it was that what we were doing was having influence.
Okay.
So in Allen Ron and the In-Fisherman in general was part of this, because In-Fisherman was always about being a smaller part of this larger audience, a more intense group of anglers wanting to know more and more and more about whatever had to do with fishing, and the quality part of it, the production of better fishing, more and bigger fish was all part of the intensity of the crowd. We wanted to catch big fish. And so it wasn't just guys wanting to go and, I mean, that's always been part of the process. That's another part of the story, because we've always been about selective harvest, even, at least eventually. But so it was the real thing that finally connected it all was an article that I wrote for In-Fisherman, and I don't even remember the name of it, but it was an open letter to fishery scientists, and it was all about what are anglers actually looking for, and how can fisheries people accommodate what they're looking for, and back and forth and back and forth. And that connected me to a swath of fisheries people across the United States, well, across North America, really, which was eventually what led to many of the changes that have happened over the course of years in fishing. The other thing, of course, was that some of this was happening on two tiers. You had the southern part of the country and you had the northern part of the country. And the two didn't mix that well, oftentimes, although Al made the transition to fishing, very well in southern tournaments, which is almost unheard of at the time. It's hard to take a guy who fishes northern natural lakes and put him on a reservoir in the south and have him do
game. Yeah, it's complicated. I went down there a while ago when I worked for Bassmaster thinking I knew how to catch a bass. Well, I can catch them here in Minnesota just fine, but I got humbled down there. You're absolutely right. It's a different culture, almost.
Well, we tried to make the transition in cultures many times, and it won't be had, or wouldn't be had. And so I think what finally began to change everything was the fact that, in another story, bass decided to move north, that they needed to move north. And
do you I feel like, and I'm curious what you think about this, there's probably been an ebb and flow, if you will, of a connection and a willingness to work with the biologists, the fisheries managers, and then the anglers. I feel like there's just a rift that's been there for a very long time. Sometimes they consider what anglers have to say, sometimes they don't, when they probably should, and vice versa, when some anglers maybe ought to consider what the fisheries biologists are saying. Do you feel like that gap has ever been effectively bridged?
Well, that was the gap that I addressed in that initial article. And I think it's been bridged for the most part quite well.
Yeah.
Certainly a gigantic change from the 70s to where we are today. Now, you may still find some pockets of hard-headedness and whatever as you travel around the country, but for the most part, I think fisheries people are some of the most remarkable people in the corner of great angling, that there is. I mean, first and foremost, it's the science. But the science leads to what their constituency is looking for, and they're quite aware of that for the most part. That's the big change. I think the fishery side of things is, really done quite remarkable.
It's definitely, well, I mean, we're enjoying fantastic fishing yet today, and we'll get into this later, the changes you've seen here in Minnesota. But I want to give you an example of something this is a good story. This is probably worth a podcast in itself. But when muskies started getting put in many of the Iowa reservoirs, so not the Iowa Great Lakes, but they were starting to put them in some of the other reservoirs, they didn't think of those fish necessarily to the level of trophy caliber that we know them to be today. So today still there's a 40-inch minimum on muskies in Iowa. And we all know that's barely even a photo fish. That's one that's not a trophy caliber muskie. But their thought is, well, think about the kid that catches one off of a dock and his grandpa wants to mount it for him. Like, I can understand that mindset, but there was a time when they put muskies in Brushy Creek. You remember that reservoir by Fort Dodge?
Bit, yeah.
So I was living there. That was actually my first outdoor gig. I was working at the Iowa Sportsman magazine, and I was trying to learn how to musky fish in Brushy Creek, and it's full of timber. So the last thing you want to do is throw a bait with 17 hooks hanging off of it into the wood. But eventually you had to figure that out. Well, we discovered we weren't seeing any fish, weren't experiencing any encounters, weren't hardly catching anything, and we started seeing people below the spillway down at the bottom of the ramp where the water spills over the dam in a controlled manner, and there were muskies all over down in there. We're like, oh, well, let's go down. So me and a couple buddies went down and we're waiting, and I think we caught 12 muskies in like 2 hours, waiting in the spillway. And it wasn't rough, it wasn't dangerous. Mm-hmm. Well, we started inquiring with the DNR about the numbers that they had stocked in there, and they gave us the formula. It was approximately 1 fish per acre, but stocking efforts following the initial stocking were down to about half a fish per acre. Mm-hmm. We did the math, Doug, and we discovered that well over 3/4 of the fish that they had stocked had gone over the spillway when we're down in the tailwaters of the dam there. Mm-hmm. And we got together with some of the members of there was a Des Moines Muskie Club. There was one from Cedar Rapids that was not Muskies Inc. affiliated, but a group of guys. We had 10 or 12 guys there. We did get permission from the DNR because it was considered a different body of water at that point, because once it becomes riverine, it's different. So we told them what we were going to do. We wanted to catch the muskies. We wanted to take them back up to the lake and release them. And they're like, we don't know why you'd want to do that, but okay. And the game warden was in support. Like we had the proper clearance. So I think in a matter of 2 to 4 weeks, we moved like 68 muskies.
Wow.
Now, I don't know that any of them went back over because there wasn't a lot of water that they could have swam through. So we think we moved 68. We'd put them head first in a 5-gallon bucket, wrap their body in a towel, and then we had this hill we had to climb, which was the worst part. The point of this whole story was we presented this data to the head of fisheries in Iowa at muskie meetings that they were having around the muskie fisheries there, and they denied it. They said that's not true. Those fish, there's only a small percentage going over. But when we gave them, you have this number of stocking fish, and we're assuming there's probably a percentage of mortality that occurs, we can determine that most of the fish end up below the spillway. Well, it was a headache. It was a fight. Long story short, they eventually decided to try to put barriers on 2 of these lakes, Brushy Creek and then Big Creek. Mm-hmm. So those barriers are there now because we kind of went to battle with them about it. And the muskie fishery in Brushy Creek is excellent now. Yeah. We've tried to go and film there, and it hasn't worked very well, but they're in there. So I think if there is a bridge to gap, or a gap to bridge, it is the anglers, while not carrying degrees in biology and management and things of that nature, do present a pretty important perspective that I think that the departments need to at least listen to.
Oh, absolutely. That's part of the initial thing that, my initial observation.
Mm-hmm. But you're right. There are pockets of, we'll call it belligerence, where I don't think people want to listen. And that person's still in charge down there in Iowa, so we'll leave his name out of this. But go back to your early days with Toad. That guy fascinated me. I would have loved to have met him. Talk a little bit about your first encounter with him.
Well, actually, so I had his kids in school. So John and Elliot and the daughter. And so I knew of Toad and his fishing prowess. And but he never showed up at teacher conferences. So I said, what he's always ask his wife, where's Toad? You know, and I was always hoping he'd show up, but he never did. So, so he was a part-time carpenter, electrician. He did a lot of different things over the years, and eventually he was also a deputy sheriff. So the first time I actually met him was when I was coming back from the Iowa Great Lakes one day, and I picked up a roadkill deer and threw him in the back of, I had a 315 Lund at that time. So I threw this small deer in the back of the 315 Lund. Back in the day, you had to, if you were going to keep a roadkill, you had to contact the some authority.
Mm-hmm. Get a salvage tag or something.
Yeah. So out comes Toad, and he's a great bow hunter, you know, and has killed all kinds of deer, hundreds of deer. And he comes and he looks in the back of my 315 Lund, and he snickers a little bit. And so that was my first encounter, my first encounter with Toad. So eventually, I really didn't actually fish with him until he had a heart attack, probably in about 1980. You know, I don't really, it was 83, 84, 85. I don't remember the time frame anymore. And so by that time, he knew of my interest in catfishing and fishing in general. And we had a common friend, Barry Day, who eventually worked for Berkeley for a long time as a fisheries specialist. And so we just, I don't remember exactly the first encounter, but basically he said I was the only one that would fish with him after he had his heart attack, because everybody else was scared of waking up with a stiff in the morning in the bed, you know, if we had, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, but I don't know. Anyway, so that was Toad. And so we started to fish together. We fished the catfish in the creeks, and we would fish the Iowa Great Lakes. And we spent a lot of time fishing for walleyes in the prairie lakes, especially in southwestern Minnesota. But also we fished the northeastern corner of South Dakota also. Mm-hmm. So, and just the first thing you knew about Toad, there's these people that have a presence about them when they enter a room. I am not like that. I am calculating and calculated, and when I want to write something, I know what I want to write about, etc. But I am not this giant personality that, you know, well, Toad was that kind of personality, and you saw that. He was easy to talk to, always full of practical jokes, always looking to do this or that or whatever, and to the point of distraction. And he got away with things that blonde jokes and back in the day that no one would ever get away with today. But so he was that kind of character, and I saw that, and I wrote. He didn't. He started to write later on and wasn't too bad at it. So I started to incorporate him naturally into some of the catfish stuff, and I could take a small license with some of the stuff with him, and so so it was part and parcel of don't let the absolute whole 100% truth get in the way of a good story sometimes, type of thing.
That's fair.
But he was a remarkable character, and if you told the story right, that's what drew people to the catfishing more than I ever could if I had sat down and tried to write or pen this technical article about catfishing, tying science to this and that to that. So he was the bridge for me to make the connection to the more populous audience out there. And it was a big audience anyway. It was a natural one, just wanting to be addressed. So you've always had about 7 million catfishermen, even back in the mid-1970s when no one addressed the market. Mm-hmm. So
I feel like, and I think you just said something that really probably has been on my mind anyways since those early catfish days for me, is you won't take this credit, but you and Toad made catfishing cool. You really did.
No, I think that's true. But it's not like, okay, what do I keep saying this over and over again? No, somebody else has to say it.
Yeah.
But it is true. That was part of how catfishing, hit the scene.
Well, so was he, obviously spent a lot of time in the woods in the fall. Seems like just a lifetime outdoorsman. Was he good at pretty much everything he did in the outdoors? Was it kind of a natural thing to him?
Yeah, he was pretty good at everything. He was a natural shooter chunk with either a longbow. In the early days, before he had his heart attack, he was brutally strong. I remember the boys having in their sheriff's office one of the early, what are they, Nautilus? No, not Nautilus, the heavy machines.
Yeah.
So these guys are bench pressing, I'm thinking 600 pounds, so he was shooting a 120 pound or 110 pound longbow in the early days. But he learned that didn't,
it's going to tear your shoulder apart.
Yeah, you're a lot more accurate, but he was a natural born instinctive shooter. So long story, he was an early part of the intense bow hunting scene in Iowa also.
Yeah, there was a group developed, the Iowa Deer or Iowa Bow Hunters Association or something. I think there was, don't quote me on this, but there was something there was some literature or something, and he was included in that. Like one of the original founding members of this association. And it was my early days of bow hunting too. And I was kind of like, oh my gosh, that's the same guy. And, I kind of started to put together what I wanted or what I thought maybe my life would look like as an adult. And that was I'm like, I want to be doing this kind of stuff. I want to be talking about fishing and hunting. And I didn't know at the time it was okay to do both, being a high school kid or younger, I thought you kind of had to pick one way to go or the other, but I saw something at some swap meet in Des Moines where his picture was included and he was unmistakable,
Yeah, no, he participated in all those kinds of things in eastern Iowa and central Iowa.
So you guys eventually kind of worked him into the fold, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit. I mean, there's another podcast we're going to do about your integration into In-Fisherman, and so I don't want to jump too far ahead, but since we're on the topic of Toad, he became kind of a personality within the catfish videos, and I suppose you worked him into the articles too. Did he ever have aspirations to, I guess, not work a regular job and guide, or what was his?
Yeah, that became part of what happened.
That's okay.
He stopped doing some of the things that he was doing in favor of doing some promotional work. He wrote a bow hunting book about hunting in cornfields, which he sort of probably pioneered.
Which is all you can do up in that part of the state of Iowa.
Well, the whole thing with the cornfield is it's what's left over after everything's harvested, and there's a few fields, and there, as you say, there's no real other place for the deer to hide. There's a few ditches and things like that, but basically it's the cornfields. So he pioneered that kind of thing, but he was always an integral part of the bow hunting scene in Iowa, and got to know some of the better, bow hunting people. M.R. James at Bow Hunter, so worked with him a little bit. I'd have to, a lot of the, when you hit me off the cuff, if I went back and looked. Yeah, I could put it together for you just a bit better.
Well, we can certainly dig into a deeper dive here. I'm fascinated by that time personally, because it's my motherland, as I said, but also that was my early inspiration to. There was a day when I really wanted to just go fishing, and when my dad bought me a In-Fisherman tape the first year we moved from Wisconsin to Iowa. I've told this story all the time here. that really inspired me. But that inspired me to really embrace the love for fishing. But it was the catfish stuff that inspired me to tackle and embrace the science of fishing, and that was.
Okay.
That was Toad. That was you. That was, that crew of cat daddies, if you will, that really kind of paved the way. So the catfishing world has there's still kind of a grizzled portion of that the incorrect assumption is that they're uneducated, but there's absolutely a science behind those fish as much as there is bass, walleyes,
Of course.
across the board. So in your expansion from the northwest Iowa creeks and smaller rivers, what did you take from those days? And was Toad a part of this, where you guys went and fished some bigger reservoirs, went south to fish bigger rivers and explore that?
I worked with Toad from about 86 through, I think he died in November of 91. So we fished we did some fishing on the reservoirs in South Dakota. We certainly fished the Minnesota River for flatheads. We finally got interested a few years into it in flathead catfishing, and then went head over heels in search of flatheads. So we had flatheads. When I was growing up, there were not many flatheads in the Big Sioux River in Iowa, along the Iowa-South Dakota border. There got to be more of them as we got into the 1980s. Well, the Minnesota River was always a top-notch flathead fishery. So we went and fished that. So there was that exploration. We did not explore a lot farther than those two rivers for flatheads, although we did fish some of the stocked lakes. Back in that day, Minnesota was oftentimes, not oftentimes, but occasionally would take flatheads and put them in smaller natural lakes and reservoirs to thin out bullhead populations. So we fished some of those waters. So that's what got us into flathead fishing, but we didn't head south. We didn't fish, that came later. Some of it, you cannot do it all. And so as we started to get the ball rolling when it came to catfishing, it was obvious that there was this gigantic audience out there, all these fisheries people in different areas of the country, and they were all waiting to be heard from. They were all waiting to be put on record, whether they were catfish anglers. And some of them, as you say, were very primitive folks. That all began to change over time, just as walleye fishing went through the same landscape. You went from some primitive interest to a desire to fish competitively. It's the same old story in every, with every fish and every fishery. Mm-hmm. Catfishing at its heart, though, still remains utterly simple. So I just watched, and you haven't watched this yet, but show 11 for 2025 has your segment with Rob Newman, where you take the new flat bottom boat with the jet on it and go to the Red River, one of the most famous rivers in the country, and go and catch gigantic, up to 22 pounds, it looked like to me, channel catfish in a nice outing on the river where you probably caught 30 fish. I don't know how many, but a lot. And it's the same old rig over and over. A little modification here, but it's basically hook, sliding sinker. Most of the time you want it sliding all the way down to the hook. You don't need a leader at all. We discovered that. I think that we were one of the first ones to ever talk about that, because when we first went and fished the Red River, below the Selkirk Dam, where you have now been also, heavy current. You're always snagged if you're always fishing the classic old leader style. So, and catfish don't know what a sinker is. They don't, okay. So it slides up right against the hook just as well. So, but talking about, it's just simple fishing.
But being able to apply the science and having that work, to me, putting everything together, having the success come to it, it's like the ultimate springboard into other species, because the baseline of applying the components and recognizing, certain elements of the river that might hold a fish, or starting to eliminate water, the process of that, I think, is what really led me into these other species. And I'm sure you'll agree. There's special interest groups for every single species out there, and
Yeah,
a
absolutely.
lot of them have a tendency to look down their nose at anybody that fishes for anything else. Like, I'm only a musky fisherman, I'm only a bass, walleye, whatever. And that's fine. If that gets you out of the bed in the morning, I don't care. But I've committed to not being that way, because those trips you mentioned, going to Selkirk and then fishing the Red River with Rob, I was as giddy as a school kid. Like, to get back to ultimately two fisheries that I've known about, and I've always wanted to go to Selkirk, and we got to put that on the schedule again this year. I might have that on my list for you coming up. But that, I don't ever want to be perceived as the angler that has moved beyond what made me, if you will. And I don't just stick to that for the sake of sticking to it, but because I really, truly love the opportunity to go catch catfish anywhere they swim. And that really does. It means a lot to me that those fish are still so readily available. And, we've talked about this also. Just about anywhere you live in the country, with a few exceptions, you're not too far away from catchable catfish.
Right. Channel cats in 44 states.
That's right.
And 5 provinces, I think it is, but I'd have to check it.
Tommy caught a bullhead through the ice last weekend.
Oh.
And he's like, "What is this? I don't even want to touch it." And he's got his hands up. I'm like, "Buddy, man, you got to learn to respect the bullhead." I said, "Doug would be mad if he knew you threw that back."
Yeah, I would.
Well, I think it's a good testament to the reaches of fishing literature and just the love of catfish across the country. And we did get kind of sidelined here, and we're closing in on an hour. So I told you we'd be about an hour, but I do want to get a little bit more of that timeline. So you were the next podcast we're going to record, I want to dig into your introduction to working at In-Fisherman and how we're gonna move through that in the magazine, and et cetera. There's a lot of cool stories that I already can't wait to ask you about. However, there's a time when you were teaching that you had reached out to Al and Ron about writing an article, and I want you to kind of take us from that point up into where you probably decided that teaching was, you'd done your due diligence with teaching and it was time to move on. So talk about that timeline.
So I'm starting to write about fishing probably about 1974 or 5. But I don't have any outlets other than the only real outlet is Fishing Facts magazine.
And just to be clear, when we talk about writing, in those days, were you pen to paper? Did you have a typewriter, word processor? What was the
No,
means?
it was old school typewriter.
Okay.
And I will, just out of curiosity, see if I can find a copy of that original letter that I wrote to Al back in the day. So let's just say by 76, I was in contact I was doing articles for Fishing Facts magazine. Editors there, Carl Maltz, mostly I worked with Spence Petros. By that time, the Linders had sort of stopped writing for Fishing Facts. They were, often writers for Fishing Facts also. And then by 75 had started In-Fisherman. I was one of the ones early on to jump right in when the mailer came out about this deal for, In-Fisherman, 1975. I think the mailer was in 74. But so it was supposed to start in 75. Like all things, Ron often got his hands on it. Didn't always go like expected. And Al was no, writer. We always had to, he would give his ideas and we would write and that kind of thing. Ron was a writer, but a tortured one in many instances. But he still was influential. So anyway, the boys started to do the magazine, and I don't remember exactly when I wrote that first letter, but it was a letter filled with the sort of enthusiasm of the time and the enthusiasm that Al brought to everything, and to be back in that time and age. And to have Al endorse something it was like the world in the North Country. If The fact that there were so many Mercury motors was the part and parcel of the fact that he ran a Mercury motor. Now, early on in the magazine, they didn't do ads, but that soon changed. And so then they got into the whole process, and that kind of thing. But you're asking about, eventually, they were short of material. They're always behind. So this was interesting material. They said, okay, fine. I can dig up the first magazine. I thought it was 1977, but it was actually 1978. I think the February magazine where the first column appeared. So I started to do those every magazine from then on. So 78, 79. In 79, I had met the boys before, at least one time. And in 78, they invited me to go along on a big TV shoot, their first actual In-Fisherman TV shoot to Pipestone Lake in Minnesota. So I went along. By that time, I was a hardcore musky boy. I fished for muskies. We did a musky TV shoot. I did with a guy by the name of Tony Portencaso from Chicago, who was also a great musky angler. And I'm not calling myself a great musky angler at the time, but Portencaso was.
Sure.
And so that was the start of a connection. And so they knew who I was. One of their editors at the time was not deeply into the whole fishing thing, more of a literature kind of guy, but not really a big fisherman. Scott Peterson was the original editor. A very smart guy, but not a curious angler for that matter. I'm afraid. And so eventually he left in, I think it was 1980. And by that time, I had gotten to know them enough that they knew that I could write. I had by that time written a variety of feature articles for them, including the first ever articles written about the connection between tracking fish and so how this would affect anglers. Mm-hmm. So I did a musky one from tracking on on West Okoboji. But before that, I had worked with a guy, John Pitlow, who was tracking walleyes in a Spirit Lake. And I'll throw in one curious observation about working with him on Spirit Lake. Mm-hmm. We followed a walleye on Spirit Lake that traveled 7 miles in 1 hour by radio transmitter. And that now is being was unfathomable at that time, but now with the forward-facing sonar, you guys are beginning to see that. This is so common that it's not even remarkable.
Yeah.
And on the Great Lakes in particular. So anyway, eventually this guy leaves. They have an opening. I say, well, I'll do this. You got to pay me. But all I'm looking forward to is the fact that I want to really do this, but I have to look out for my family. Mm-hmm. So I'm a poor teacher in Iowa, but my wife is a teacher. So I calculate what my meager salary is and her meager salary, and I ask for that amount of money, which seems to take Al's breath away, but that's part of the marketing process. But they finally bid on the bullet, and so in 1981, in May, after school was out, I moved to at least, Brainerd, Minnesota, to be part of the In-Fisherman staff.
Was there anybody in your decision-making process there that was like, "Now, come on, Doug, you need to probably keep a real job here and stick on the path you're on"? Was anybody ever that way, or did everybody encourage it?
Well, I didn't have that many people in my sphere that would be commenting on it. My parents would have always been in favor of me doing whatever I would have wanted. Wife was a little hesitant, unfortunately, or whatever, but that was natural. Mm-hmm. So we had family in Iowa, close by, and so it was a big move.
I can imagine. A similar feeling for us was when we left Minnesota to go to Alabama. Catherine was very apprehensive. So was I. It was scary, right? But it was, as you'd probably agree, it was one of the best decisions we could have made. But you definitely kind of have to put your money where your mouth is once in a while and move forward. But so you're looking at a new career, a shift. You're moving to Brainerd. We'll touch on the In-Fisherman thing in the next episode, but I want you to talk about that move. Did you get everything in one trip? Did you make multiple trips? What was Brainerd? Was it everything you expected when you guys got set up here?
Well, we had to find a place to live, obviously, and I do not. There's a lot of things that I can remember. What eventually becomes inconsequential to me gets shut out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so something like that, I don't remember the details at all. I remember we found a place to live that wasn't, it was a decent little, nice little ranch-style home, not far from where the office was at that time. And we made the move, and the roads were all gravel where we were. Now everything's paved, and you've got city, and there was nothing where... there's everything where there was nothing back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
There was a bar with Jello wrestling down the street from the office. Anyway, so that's about.
Is that how you made up your extra money to pay for the first boat?
No, I don't think so.
No. What was the closest lake to where you lived right away?
Well, we literally lived right in Baxter, so Perch is the lake that I live on now. But we live on a back bay. It's not like we live on a nicest part of the lake. But so Perch was there within a mile, and that's where the Linders had their home on Perch Lake. So he had access to the lake, which was one of the most important things that actually happened fisheries-wise to In-Fishermen in those early days, because the boys made the observation to the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources that they would like to tag fish on Perch Lake to show where the fish go and what they do, and the fact of how vulnerable they could be. Mm-hmm. And they did indeed prove that. Is this where you want to go?
Yeah, no, you're doing great.
Okay, well, so this would have been probably 1975. They approached the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources to be able to do a tagging study on Perch Lake, which is Al's home lake. At the time, there's no access. At the time, the first time I fished it, and to this day, I think it was the best natural bass lake that I have ever fished. Full of fish to 4.5 pounds. Not some bigger, but mostly just full of amazing fish. Mm-hmm. Well, the DNR estimated 1,600 adult fish in the lake. In the first 6 months, they tagged, it's either 700 or 800 or 900 fish. I'll have to look.
Wow.
But a huge proportion of the population, and they had already made the observation in their own minds that fish populations were vulnerable. We didn't practice what we preached back in that day. Mm-hmm. We had stringer shots. That's how they sold the magazine. The boys came from a background of barnstorming, and the way you sell lures is to have fish stringers. Mm-hmm. And so we continued that into the late 1970s for sure, and then started to make the transition away from such those kinds of things to individual, shots, but we digressed and regressed many times over the years too. So
it's funny how that mentality is still cooked into anglers today. I mean, the wall back here, there's numbers of stringer shots we can see, and that, I suppose in the day, that was the picture that the fans of the magazines or the baits wanted to have of their own. That was the trophy shot.
It was the means by which you proved your competence and your relevancy as a writer or as a promoter, and so on.
Well, and today it's can you put 2 big bass in your live well, or if you're with a buddy, 4, and then you drive around and haul them around just for the sake of taking a picture later. And I've tried to move away from that myself, but I mean the take a picture for the gram, take a pic for the gram that's the modern thing today too, and it's exactly the same. But I want you to tell one story. Since we're on the catfish, we've talked a lot about catfish and everything. I want you to tell the story that you told me about Grumpy Old Men.
No.
Will you tell that to wrap things up today?
Well,
this is a good story, Doug.
so back in the day, Grumpy Old Men, I don't remember, my connection was Grumpier Old Men.
It was Grumpier Old Men, yes.
So catfish, what was the catfish's name?
Catfish Hunter.
Catfish Hunter, okay. So I'm back in that day, there are no recognized catfish experts. Me, because I had started this, so I don't know what, this has got to be 89 maybe?
I'm going to check. Yeah, carry on.
Okay, so I get a call from the chief grip, which is the chief organizer of
95.
95, wow. So this is after Toad for sure. Okay, so I get a call from this Hollywood guy asking me about catfish and would I help with the filming of Grumpier Old Men. And I said, well, cool, but, I don't know. So he says, well, can you get us some of these fish? We've never seen them before. They're the heart and soul of the scripting. I said, so you want me to get you some flathead catfish? And this is in March, I believe, or I don't remember for sure.
Did they get a hold of you here at the office, like you had an answering machine that they left a message on or sent a letter? How'd they get a hold of you?
Well, it was a different office at the time.
Okay.
So it was the office pre this one. And, but yes, I don't remember. But so eventually I'm on the phone with this Hollywood guy asking me to get flathead catfish. I said, well, I can get some, but I can't get them myself. But I know, so I knew some commercial guys in Winona who could get us the catfish. He says, well, get us these catfish then. I said, well, I'll get what we can. And so we set up a meeting. I get a hold of the commercial guy. He says, sure, fine, I'll do this. What the hell? And so we set up a meeting for they were shooting a lot of stuff in those days at a place that they've shot a lot of stuff in Minneapolis near the fairgrounds, I think it is. Mm-hmm. So we set up a meeting, but this meeting takes place on Lake Street. Not a great place to meet, but that's where we met. So kind of a iffy. So the commercial guy shows up. I show up. The commercial guy shows me the catfish. Not bad. He's got 3 in there, about 40 pounds. And so Howard Deutsch is the director of Grumpier Old Men. Well, he's a little short guy and full of piss and vinegar, I guess you'd have to say. Mm-hmm. So they drive up. He drives up in a big limo, and out he pops. And he runs around there, and he runs around here. He's full of energy and this kind of thing. Show me the catfish. Show me the catfish. So I show him the cat. We open up the thing, and they show him the catfish. And he says, wow. He says, are these big ones? I said, well, these are as big as we can get in Minnesota. They're 40-pound fish. We might have got a 50, but he says, well, how big did they get? And I says, well, in the South, they get 70, 80 pounds. And that was the wrong thing to say.
I want those.
He says, well, get me some of those. We got to have those. I said, well, I can't get those for you. I said, but we can probably, find somebody who can. So then he pops back in the car, and away you go. And then they asked me to be the catfish expert on set with them through this filming process. Well, what the hell? I can't stand there and wait for 3 months while they film this.
Yeah.
So I said, I can't do it. I got too much to do here. I got, full-time magazine job. But here I could have rubbed elbows with Walter Lemon and, Mathau.
Jack Lemmon. And
Jack Lemmon.
Yep.
And Sophia Loren, Anne Margaret, holy moly, as Mathau would always, say.
Holy moly.
And so I missed my chance at stardom there, and they ended up getting these catfish from the South, but they ended up, and I followed along with the grip from time to time to see how things were going. And they finally ended up not using any of the live catfish, but the end scenes were a mechanical catfish.
Mm-hmm. You can kind of tell when you watch it. You knew that I thought there was a real fish in the mix somewhere.
There,
in some of the
I think
shots.
when they got him in the boat, I think it was the real fish.
It looked like it.
So
you,
excuse me.
You had to. I can't imagine when he popped out of that limo. I mean, what kind of tank was he in? Was it a trailer tank that the fish was in, or in the back of a truck?
A regular commercial hauling truck. So. Big aeration system, big stainless steel tanks.
And you were going to have to keep that fish alive in that tank for an extended period of time. So when it was ready, right? I mean,
yeah, probably, or some alternative of using one of the lakes in the area with netting or something like that.
Yeah, I don't think you made the wrong decision, but you missed your shot.
Well, it would have been nice if I could have just showed up and rubbed elbows with the boys and the girls from time to time.
Have dinner with that is in our family. We will watch Grumpy Old Men and Grumpier Old Men once a year together. I love them. They're fantastic. And of course, we lived in Watertown, Minnesota, which is right down the road from Delano. What's the lake there? I think was it Rebecca Lake that they filmed the ice scenes on? I believe
that was never verified in my mind, but
someone told us that there's a park there. Anyway, so we went and actually ice fished on that lake a few times. You know, like we were looking for the green hornet.
I gotcha.
Doug, that's a good story. That's one of my favorites. But we have a lot more, and I know that. As we're right at the time of filming here, time of recording, we're actually in early January. And if you're into our magazine, you know that this is one of the busiest times of year that we have to aggregate content, get things sent off to the printer. And so we're all kind of stretched pretty thin. So I do want to do this again. I'll give you a couple days off. Maybe we can find a day next week or the week after to dig into your early In-Fisherman days. But my goal with this podcast is to tell the story of In-Fisherman, what I think is one of the greatest fishing stories to be told. And so I have a lot more questions for you. I'll lay off today, but I really appreciate you making the time to do this. This has been fun.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah, we're over an hour, so I can shut this thing off. Hey, thanks for listening to In-Fisherman Storyline. This is Thomas Allen from Doug Stange. We will catch you here next time.